Jackson County recently held a workshop on the integration of non-lethal predation tools and methods into county wolf management strategies. For those of you who couldn't make it, here's an overview, or watch the entire workshop at jacksoncounty.org.
The purpose of this workshop, it's an educational workshop, and that's what, and we're focused on what the role of non-lethal methods in predation management with a focus on wolves. Now, I know as soon as I mention wolves, that there's a lot of opinions, a lot of strong feelings either way about wolves, and I just want to direct people to say that we're not here to discuss whether wolves belong on the landscape. This is a workshop on dealing with the realities of wolves on the landscape, because that decision of whether wolves are going to be on landscape, that's already been made by the state of Oregon, and it's already played out and continues to play out as far as how they should be managed and what have you. But non-lethal is certainly a component of the state's plan to manage wolves, and that's what we're going to focus on today.
Wolves are still fairly new to this part of the state, and a lot of rumors flying around about how they got here, and people alleging that we're kicking them out of the back of the truck in the dark of the night and things like that. So I kind of want to give everybody a little background on how the wolf recovery effort going way back to the start of it in the 80s and 90s, and how we got to where we are today, and then we can talk a little bit about the situation here and some of the depredation prevention efforts that we have going on. So just quickly, just give you I guess I got to stay here. I tend to move around when I talk. So that's OR7, the famous wolf that's come to this part of the state, just kind of giving you a little comparison of a wolf versus a coyote. In terms of, we get a lot of reported sightings, and if you're out there and see something, just make sure. I'm hearing a buzz. Are you? Yeah. Okay.
We're adjusting the lights.
Gotcha. Okay. Oh, okay. If you do see an animal out there and are trying to decide whether it's a wolf or a coyote, really focus in on the head and the ears. Look at, a wolf has a much big blockier head. The ears are very short in relationship to the head. Coyotes have those long pointy ears and that pointy snout. That's really the best thing to look for if you're trying to identify a wolf versus a coyote, because even though there's a huge size difference between the two, the size can really be deceptive if it's off in the distance. So the other thing I just wanted to point out too is how different wolves can look at different times of the year and over their lifespan. This is another shot of OR7 a couple years later in the late summer, looking really lean after they've been feeding pups for several months and things. So wolves can be, he was probably maybe 105 pounds there in the early spring in 2014, and then a few years later in the end of the summer after feeding pups be down to 85, 90 pounds. They really vary a lot in their size and even their color. This is a more recent picture of him just from last spring. So it's kind of amazing how they can look different times of year. So just going back to the kind of the history here, back in 1980, the only place where wolves occurred in the lower 48 was in northern Minnesota and in Isle Royale and in Lake Superior. There's always been a lot of wolves up in northern Canada and Alaska. Up around 60,000 is the estimate up in those parts. But in the lower 48, although they had been throughout most of the country, historically, the only place they occurred is in Minnesota, and so they were listed. Actually, when the Endangered Species Act came into being in the 1970s, they were listed as endangered species, and recovery efforts were launched to try to bring them back to some of their former range. Those recovery efforts focused, at least the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's recovery efforts focused on three main areas: the Western Great Lakes, so that Minnesota, Wisconsin, population, the northern Rocky Mountains, and then the Mexican gray wolf down in the southwest in eastern New Mexico and western Arizona, or eastern Arizona and western New Mexico. What I'll primarily be talking about here is the northern Rocky Mountains population, because that's what that recovery and growth of that population is why we have wolves in Oregon today. So when they were looking to where to reintroduce wolves or where to try to recover wolves in the northern in the Rocky Mountains, they were trying to focus on some of the most remote areas that also had good game populations that could sustain a wolf population. This is kind of an interesting map. The white areas are areas of where the human footprint on the landscape is the least, and then the red is where not necessarily where people live, but where human activity occurs. And so when they identified recovery areas, the spots you can see, they focused on those white remote areas, the area around Glacier National Park and the Bob Marshall Wilderness in northern Montana, Yellowstone National Park and the area around that, and then central Idaho, the River of No Return Wilderness in Frank Church.
Yes.
Man, I don't know. So that's where the Fish and Wildlife Service focused their recovery efforts. In 1995, they released 15 into central Idaho and 14 into Yellowstone National Park. They did another release in the winter of 1996. In Yellowstone, I'll keep trying to. In Yellowstone, they did what they call a soft release, where they had holding pens and acclimated them for quite a while before they released them. In Idaho, they had a hard release where they basically just kicked them out of the back of the truck. Both techniques were extremely successful. These populations did very well. I try to stress it every time I talk. This was the only release of wolves that occurred. Everything we're seeing now is a result of the growth of this population and also the growth in northwest Montana. Wolves had already migrated down from Canada, so they weren't reintroduced into northern Montana, but that population has grown too. There has been no other releases in this part of the country. It's everybody claims that we've been dropping them off in Oregon. It's just not true. This is it. That's if you remember anything from what I said today, remember that, because we hear so much criticism on that issue. So you can see this is just a graph. This is you can see where the reintroduction is there. The green bar is the Yellowstone area. The central Idaho is the orange, and northwest Montana is that magenta color. With the reintroduction, putting a critical mass of animals in really good habitat where there was abundant prey, those populations just took off after the reintroduction. Northwest Montana, where they were dispersing in on their own from Canada, and it was kind of just kind of trickling in, was a much slower rate of growth. And that's kind of the Northwest Montana example is more similar to what we have in Oregon, because they're doing the same thing. They're migrating in on their own, kind of a handful at a time, and so that's why in Oregon now we're getting a fairly substantial wolf population, but it's been a slow, gradual increase. I expect it'll be a slow, gradual increase in Western Oregon too, because of they're just kind of moving in on their own slowly. And also too, if you guys have any questions while I'm talking, feel free to raise your hand. I'd be happy to answer questions. This is just a very busy table about wolf depredations in the northern Rockies. The one thing though, I don't know, does this have a, oh it does, okay, good. I'll go ahead. Kind of a tough angle. Just the one thing though that I think is interesting to point out is that during this period when wolves were recovering in the northern Rockies, they did, because of the experimental population rules and things, were able to remove wolves that were causing chronic depredation problems. And they actually ended up removing quite a few wolves. If you just, that bottom line that's highlighted in red are wolves that were killed for chronic depredation. And while they did that, still that you saw that graph of the population increase during that time, it did not have any appreciable effect on the wolf recovery effort to be removing the wolves that were chronically depredating. And I think it made the wolf recovery effort a lot more tolerable for livestock producers in that region. So this is just these slides are a little old, but by 2012 there were 1,600 wolves in the northern Rocky Mountain recovery area. So that's, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and now into eastern Oregon and Washington. That's, they were delisted in 2011 from the federal level, so the states are entirely in control of management. And they have, this population maybe level is a little bit lower now. They do in Montana and Idaho, they do have hunts for wolves now, but the population is remaining remarkably stable in the northern Rockies, and it's doing very well. Just kind of by comparison to show you the recovery effort in the Western Great Lakes, which was also highly successful. It's actually a bigger population. It's over 3,500 wolves in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So this recovery effort was also very, very successful. The Southwest, the Mexican gray wolf recovery effort has been a lot slower. It has not done nearly as well. It was 75 in 2012. I believe it's about at 100 now. It's just, in terms of that map I showed you early on about, human footprint on the landscape. This area has a lot more human activity than some of the remote areas we have in the Northwest, and it's been a struggle to recover wolves in that area, but they're still continuing, and they're holding on steady, but they're not really increasing like they did in the other two areas. So, as of 2013, in the Fish and Wildlife Service's recovery efforts from, where we had them just in northern Minnesota, they had expanded into these three recovery areas. Quite a, from our standpoint, quite a successful recovery effort in those areas. The wolves were listed, federally listed across the whole western U.S., so, they hadn't occupied all of their former range, but we had brought them back to the areas that were probably the most, the best areas to recover them in terms of prey availability and minimizing impacts on human land uses. So in 1999 was the first wolf that appeared in Oregon, which, as you saw from the earlier thing, the reintroduction to Idaho only occurred in 95 and 96, so it didn't actually take long for one disperser to take off and get into Oregon. He came through the Baker City area and then was in Grant County in the John Day River Basin. This guy really caught Oregon by surprise. They hadn't really been thinking about wolves in the state at that point in time, and so it was captured and taken back to Idaho. So, but it was really kind of a wake-up call for Oregon that, even though the recovery effort wasn't centered in Oregon, the population was expanding in Idaho and they were coming this way. And so back in, I think it was 2003, the Oregon got started with their wolf planning effort, formed a stakeholder advisory committee that represented all the various interests that people concerned about wolves coming, other people that really wanted wolves back, and by 2004 they had developed a wolf plan for the state, which was really great. I mean, I think it got it, because even though this one was in '99, it actually took quite a few more years before it was I think it was 2004 when or 2005 when we first started actually having wolf packs in the state, and so Oregon got ahead of the game and was ready by the time that wolves actually became established. So all of Oregon's wolves so far, we've done a lot of DNA testing of scat and things to determine the origin of the wolves that are here. They've all tested out as coming from the Idaho population. This was a wolf called B300 in Idaho, and she ended up being, I'll go back. She ended up being OR2, which was the breeding female of the Imnaha pack, and so she's was one of the kind of the founding members of the Oregon wolf population. Sorry, I don't know.
No, it's not your, it's just a vibration that's happening.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I know. So, yeah. So they dispersed into Oregon. The first two packs, actually, yeah, it was more like 2008 and 2009 when we first had determined that we had packs in Oregon. The Imnaha pack in Wallowa County and the Winaha pack in northern Union County in the very northeast corner of the state. The Imnaha pack, as you guys may have heard, is that's OR7 is an offspring from that pack, as are a lot of the other dispersers. They've really spread far and wide. The Winaha pack is we haven't had any, none of their offspring have actually dispersed this way. They've been a good pack, though we haven't had any depredation problems from them. They've, our first pack, at least back to 2007, they occur in an area where there's a lot of livestock and grazing allotments, but we've never had any confirmed depredations from this pack. Knock on wood, and hopefully that continues. The Imnaha pack, so this is that OR2 on the left, who was the B300 from Idaho. These pair, OR2 and OR4, have really been a prolific pack in Imnaha. They're the parents of OR7, OR25, OR33, which all of these are long distance dispersers that came to this part of Oregon, and I'll talk about a little later. So they're really the founders of a lot of Oregon's population. There's been steady population growth in the state. Like I say, it was kind of slow getting started, but since then it's been about a 30% a year increase. 2016 it leveled off, although it's hard to say if really the population leveled off or this was a tough year for sampling last year. There was a lot of big snowpack. It was hard to get out and do winter surveys and get good accurate counts. This is a minimum population estimate of what could be confirmed through surveys. So there's undoubtedly more wolves in the state than this number indicates, but we want to try to stick with numbers that we can verify. This is as of the end of this last year and into 2016, this is the distribution of wolves in the state. As you can see, the vast majority are concentrated in the northeastern part of the state. This line here, oh no, it's not shown on this. That's actually that red line that goes down Highway 97 and Highway 395 is the state of Oregon's boundary of their wolf management zones. To the east of that line is what's called the eastern population, and the western population to the west. And they're kind of in terms of their metrics for determining what phase of wolf management they're in, they're treated as two separate areas. So right now, in fact, to the east, they're in phase 3 of their wolf management plan for the state, and to the west of that, they're still in phase 1. And there's different, kind of protection statuses based on what phase of the plan that they're in. And then this is the federal designation. So it's actually Highway 395 dropping down from Washington down to the Nevada border. To the east of that line, wolves have been federally delisted. They were part of the Northern Rocky Mountain distinct population segment. To the west of that line, they are still federally listed as endangered. So I want to talk a little bit about the long-distance dispersers that have made it to our part of the state here. OR7 is kind of the poster child for that. He's been an extremely famous wolf. There's been, I think, 3 movies made about him now. This movie was made. They made a movie about retracing the steps of OR7. I don't know who the actor is playing OR7 because they didn't have any footage of him, but he really captured people's imaginations. Yeah, they did an OR7 expedition where people retraced the steps, and they made a movie of him. I think the reason that it captured people's imagination, one, we had a GPS tracking collar on it, so we had great data on its movements and where it had come from and where it went. And then, of course, it went down into California, and the first time a wolf had been seen in California in many years, and so that really excited people. But yeah, even the Daily Mail, even in Britain, did a story on, made up something about him evading poachers and things like that. But just to kind of give you an idea of where he came, I know some of you people are quite familiar with this, but in case you're not, so he came from the Imnaha pack, was an offspring of OR2 and OR4 in northeastern, right on the Idaho border. He was collared in February of 2011, stayed with the pack until September of that year. He was about 2 years old, and then started dispersing. Went down down through John Day, kind of went south towards Burns. Didn't like what he saw, I guess, of the high desert, so he took a right and went west over towards Bend. Didn't really like what he saw around Bend, so he went down, headed south again. This has been, and I'll show some other maps too, this has kind of been a reoccurring pattern that we've seen with our collared wolves. We don't quite understand it. Everyone keeps asking us why they keep heading down to this southwestern part of the state, but it's a pattern we've seen. And of course, only about 15% of the wolves are collared, so there's probably other uncollared wolves that are going in different directions. In fact, we know there are, but he head down into Klamath County and was in the Wood River Valley by December of that year. So, he started dispersing September. By December, just a few months, he was already down near Fort Klamath. And then he, in 2012, spent most of 2012 in California, and that's, like I say, where he really got famous, and went down in Lassen County and was by himself this whole time for this whole period. And then in 2013 was back up in this part, right on the Jackson County, Klamath County line for most of 2013. And again, still by himself this whole period. And then in May of 2014, we caught a picture of this female wolf that showed up. This is why I stress the part about remember the only time we ever placed animals on the landscape was in Idaho and Yellowstone in 95 and 96. People were convinced, and rumors were circulating everywhere, that we had planted this black female to have a happy end to the story of OR7. Honest to God, we didn't do that. This one made it here on her own. She didn't have a collar on it, so we don't know the path she took. We did test scat and found out she is from the Northeast Oregon or Idaho population. Since they're so interrelated, it could be either, but she just made the same kind of journey that OR7 did a few years after he did. And the fascinating thing is in all the landscape that they did locate one another, because there aren't very many wolves on the landscape, so they clearly have some pretty sophisticated abilities to find each other out there. But they found each other, and by June they had pups, and they've had pups every year since here on the Rogue River National Forest, not too far from Prospect, and have been very successful. This is a sample of all of the wolves that have been part of that pack. This in 2017, there's the female with 2 new pups. We initially looked like we had 5 pups, which this is the biggest litter that they have ever had. In years past, the biggest litter that we know of is 3. But then, we had these trail cam pictures of 3 gray pups. You see the 2 black ones, and so we thought they had 5, but then we actually got another trail cam photo showing 3 black pups there. So they've got 6 pups this year, so big litter. So even though OR7 is 8 years old now, we're not sure what the age of the female is, but they're getting to be fairly old wolves at this point, but they're still very productive, doing well. And they'd been, until last fall, they'd had a clean mark in terms of any sort of problems with livestock. We hadn't had any depredations from the rogue pack, although in last fall in the Wood River Valley there and on the Klamath County side, they did get into livestock out there. They killed several yearling cows there in the Wood River Valley, and I'll talk a little bit later, we've implemented some preventative efforts, and the depredations did stop, but we're a little concerned this fall with the big litter that they have that there could be problems again this fall. So another long-distance disperser from the Imnaha pack is OR25. He was yearling. He was collared in May of 2014. He, again, from the Imnaha Pack, went up actually into the Blue Mountains of southeast Washington. Then, he took a slightly different path. He was over there by Mount Hood for a while, but then you can see he headed south and ended up in this same part of the state and spent a lot of time. He went into California too, spent a lot of time on the upper Williamson River in Klamath County. Yeah, so this is pretty amazing to me, and I don't know how well you can see with the lights and stuff, but this OR-25 was moving around a lot from Klamath County and then dipping into Northern California, and he'd made this same route, or he'd traveled the same route several times, but he'd been down in April of, I think this is like 2015, I believe. Been down in Northern California for about a month down there, and then on April 25th, he left at 6 p.m., and by the 6 a.m. on the 27th, so it was a little, 27-hour period, he had traveled 70 miles from there to there, and, just beelining it, this is an animal that's up that high, he just doesn't have a map or a GPS or whatever, so he clearly had an incredible memory of the landscape to be able to go, exactly where he was going, and covering the 70 miles in that amount of time. So this gives you an idea of the movement capabilities of these animals. It's pretty incredible. This was OR-28. This was a female. The other OR-7 and 25 were males. She was from a different pack in Northeast Oregon, the Mount Emily pack, and she took off in November of 2015, and in a month's time had traveled 450 miles down to Lake County, actually, around Silver Lake area, and so again, just incredible amounts of movement in a short amount of time. This is OR-3, who was actually, like I say, the third wolf collared in Oregon. He did not have a GPS collar. He had just a VHF one where you have to go out in the field to locate their signal. You don't get beamed via satellite to your computer. And he had disappeared. He had dispersed west of the Ochocos, and this week we weren't picking him up. ODFW was always scanning for him when they're doing their deer and elk comp counts, flights and things. But we thought he had died. But then he was sighted again in July of 2015, and he ended up pairing up with that OR-28. In fact, they paired up within a month of her getting down into the Silver Lake area. So again, just kind of an amazing, how do they locate one another in these areas where there's very few wolves? But they did. They paired. They had at least one pup in 2016, but OR-28 was killed in the fall of 2016. So we're not sure. We have not had any new information on this pack, or it was a forming pack. Now that the breeding female was lost, we're not sure what's happened to OR-3, and whether we don't believe we have a Silver Lake pack anymore. This is OR-33, another long-distance disperser. He was very he stood out because he was a black wolf with a very light-colored collar, and he was actually one that was pretty. He wasn't camera shy. Lots of people kept sighting him, so we got lots of sightings of OR-33. So just kind of give you an idea. These maps are probably pretty hard for you to see, but again, from 2016, from January 1st to February 8th, a month, he went from up far northern part of the state around Ukiah down to the Klamath Falls area, and this is where in February 2016 he actually was involved in a depredation in Klamath County. And then, this again from February 8th to March 31st, a span of 2 months, he was down there at Klamath. The green box is where he started that time period. The red box is where he ended it. So he went all the way up to, Lapine area, and then went back down and ended up almost where he started. So just, maybe I'm driving home the point too much, but it's the movement capabilities of these animals are incredible, so they can show up just about anywhere. Then after that, he went down into the Ashland area. He was involved in several depredations in Ashland in June of 2016. He killed a sheep and he killed several goats on neighboring farms down in that area. So he's actually, we haven't had any evidence of him in a long time. We don't think he's around anymore, but his collar got tied up in a fence and the transmitter got pulled off of the collar, so we don't have any data on his whereabouts. This map is a little bit old. I didn't have time to update it for this presentation, but just kind of the distribution of wolves currently in this part of the state. We have the rogue pack there that kind of straddles the Sky Lakes Wilderness, the Jackson and Klamath County line. OR 25 now, we have new he appears to have paired up. We've been getting trail cam photos of him with a gray wolf, and they didn't pair up. They didn't den this year, but they'll likely den next year, and they're actually have moved over, more into the Wood River Valley area. So they're kind of right up against the rogue pack. Probably the animal he's paired up with is a rogue pack female, but we're not sure of that yet. The Silver Lake animals are, like I say, the breeding female OR 28 is no longer around, so the status of that is unknown. OR 33 is no longer around either, but we continue to get sightings kind of in the Keno area of some wolf activity down there. It haven't been able to figure out whether we have a pair. We don't have any evidence that there's breeding down there, that we have a pack, but we do have, we do get lots of sightings and have picked them up on trail cams. There are wolves there, we're just not sure what their status is. And then, as you probably heard, back in 2015, they discovered a pack down in California near Mount Shasta, and they had a large litter of pups. This pack is kind of off the radar now, not sure if it even still exists, but there is another breeding pair in Northern California in Lassen County, so they've moved into Northern California now as well. So just kind of go over some of the things we've learned from the wolf recovery in the Northern Rockies and now in Oregon. Populations can grow very rapidly. The Northern Rocky Mountains population, it was 152 wolves in '96. In 12 years, it became 1,645. So population can grow fast. Oregon's population now is growing fast too. It's, as I mentioned before, because they're dispersing in on their own, it's not as fast a rate of growth as it was, say, in Idaho or Yellowstone, but we do expect the population to continue to grow rapidly, and including in this part of the state. Some information on the diet of wolves, primarily elk and deer, both in the winter and the summer. So that's their primary prey. As I'll talk a little bit in a second, we do have, they do depredate on livestock periodically, but they really, elk and deer are their primary prey. And they scavenge a lot too. Particularly these lone dispersers, if they're, when they become a pack, they become they're very efficient hunters and very adept at getting prey. But when they're lone dispersers, our impression is that they spend a lot of time actually scavenging on dead animals. Attacks on livestock. Not all packs depredate. As I mentioned, that Winaha pack has no history of depredation. On average, the study that was done in the Northern Rockies found that in any given year, about 22% of the packs depredate, so not a super high percentage. They tend to be concentrated in depredation-prone areas. I don't know if you've heard in the news, just the last couple months, the Harl Butte pack in Wallowa County has been depredating, and they've done some removals there. That's really in the same area where the Imnaha pack used to be. It was a different group of wolves, so they changed the name of the pack, but it's the same area. So it's just kind of a depredation-prone area there. The Imnaha pack had quite a bit of problems with depredations, and now the Harl Butte is too. Whereas there's other areas where we don't seem to have any problems at all. Large pack size increases depredation risk. This graph here is circled it with a red line. You can see pack size here, relative hazard of recurrent depredation. This is from a Journal of Wildlife Management article, but the larger the pack, the greater the potential for depredations, and that's kind of borne out with the problems they're having in Northeast now. The Harl Butte pack is a big pack. It's like 12 wolves. The Mount Emily pack, which they're also having some issues with, is in the double digits as well. So that's it kind of comes with the territory of larger packs. Preventative measures can be effective, which, of course, is the focus of this workshop, and you'll be hearing a lot more about. Some of the things that have really, I think we feel have helped here in Oregon is cleaning up old bone piles and carcasses on ranches. Most ranches have a bone pile somewhere because, it's not that easy to get rid of dead livestock, so they tend to pile them in a pit somewhere. That really attracts wolves, even if the bones are old, bleached. Wolves come in there, they'll gnaw on those bones, and so that just puts them in close proximity to the livestock on those ranches and can contribute to problems. So we get those cleaned up. We have radio telemetry data that shows you clean those up, and the wolves frequent those areas much less. So been doing a lot of that, keeping ranchers updated on the locations of collared wolves, range riders, flattery fencing. You can do hazing with cracker shells, and other things. Just kind of some of the things incidents we've had here locally. In June of 2016, I mentioned OR 33 killed a sheep and a couple goats on neighboring properties. Just out, you can see this is right above Ashland, just north of town. We use flattery fencing there. It's hard to see in this photo. This is called a fox light. It's a light activated device, so it doesn't emit any light during the day, but then at nighttime it starts sending out a strobe light pattern, kind of a randomized pattern that makes it less likely that the animals will get habituated to it. As I'm sure you'll hear a lot more about today, the wolves tend to, you can implement some deterrents and they work for a while, and then they get habituated to it and they're not as afraid of it, and they test things. But these fox lights can work in the short term, and if you keep moving them around, they can be effective. In our experience, they've been effective some areas, not so effective other areas, but it's been helpful. This was the OR 33 was a lone wolf depredating in this area, so maybe less likely to have reoccurring problems. But the implementation of we did not have any further depredations in that area after we implemented the preventative measures, and so I'm not sure we can take all the credit for that. The animal might have moved on anyway, but I think it was helpful. At least he was there for a while after the depredations. He was collared, and so we knew where he was, and he was lingering in the area. But with the implementation of these measures, he did not attack any more livestock. I mentioned the Wood River Valley with the rogue pack too in last fall. This area, these were in these very large pastures where it was, flattery was not an option, but what we implemented there was a lot of night presence, camping in the area. We'd drive and patrol the area where the wolves were coming in, and that also was effective too. We had one additional depredation after we started doing that right at the start, but then after we kept doing that, the attack stopped in that area too. So I think we were effective at stopping that situation, which could have continued quite a bit longer. And then this in the Prospect area, this in February of this year, OR 25 was actually over there and killed a calf. We put up flattery, used the fox lights again. The landowners there were diligent about trying to get out there at night, and more human presence at night when the wolves tend to attack. And that situation too, we didn't have any additional attacks after implementing these measures. So it can be effective. I know Jason Barber will be talking about a lot more about this, so I won't say much about it, but there is funding for prevention and compensation. This is, the counties it's done by county committees. Jackson County has a committee, Klamath County has a committee, and it's very good. There's some federal funding in it, there's state funding in it, and it provides funding both for compensation of confirmed losses and also for implementing preventative measures. So it's a good program. Chronic depredation occasionally occurs, as we're seeing in Northeast Oregon now, so not trying to suggest that the non-lethal techniques are going to work every time, but and sometimes lethal control is probably the only way to address a problem, but the preventative measures can work a lot of the time. The other big issue this is actually a bigger issue in the Northern Rockies now than the livestock depredation problem. Concern about effects on elk and deer populations. It's very contentious, but it's also really hard to assess. There's so many factors that affect deer and elk populations. It's hard to isolate what effect wolves are having, and it's a real mixed bag, I think, in the Northern Rockies. In some areas, the elk populations have significantly declined. In other areas, they're doing great and above management objectives, and it's a little bit hard to say, why there's that variability, but we are doing studies in Washington and Oregon to try to figure out what the impact will be here. Those studies are early now. Wolves just haven't been on the landscape here that long. But it's just something, particularly ODFW and WDFW, are looking at and carefully. So I think that's it. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Paul Wolf with Wildlife Services, District Supervisor, Southwest here. With your expansion, do you have any more reports up in Douglas County? Maybe I stepped out and missed it because of a phone call, but
no.
There's been nothing reported as far as wolves in Douglas County or up in that area?
Actually, just a few weeks ago, we had through ODFW's online reporting system, which is really, if you do have a wolf sighting, I would encourage people to report them through their online system. It's really a good way to do it. But we had one just really minimal report from Douglas County. Didn't really describe anything, so it wasn't a particularly credible one. So no, OR 33 was up there east of Roseburg a year or so ago, but and it's certainly very likely, particularly eastern Douglas County, a likely area for them to show up. There's a lot of game, but nothing that we know about right now. All right, thanks a lot.